Hello, testing. What is up, everybody? We're here on Power Times Live with another podcast. We got a real cool special guest with you for you guys here tonight. It's Mr. Rob Belanger, and he's going to be telling his story here real quick, kind of where he comes from. But he's a man that I've come to know over the years in the Power Trail. Took him, kind of adopted him as a pops to me now when I see him around. It's good to see him out there, and he knows a lot about our histories and knows a lot about our treaties. So I thought it'd be really great to bring Mr. Rob Belanger out tonight to talk a little bit about the treaties, talk about the histories, and he's a man that he'll say it like it is, and that's what I like about him. That all the current affairs going on today, he's been a voice for a lot of our Indigenous people here. So I'd like to say, what's up, Rod? Are you there? If you say hi to the people.
Yes, good evening there, Pat, and your sidekick there.
Mr. Jowski and the Houseski.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I seen you post something about him. He's kind of like walking on a catwalk, kind of modeling some clothes there.
Oh yeah. That's
I don't know where you found that, but that dude sure looked like your bro there.
Yeah. So looks like we have a lot of people coming on already. We have people from all over. If you guys want to just make a shout out of where you're watching from, that would be cool. We'll shout you out real quick here before we get started. So hold on here. Should have went on that.
Should have clicked.
All of a sudden, Rod.
Yeah, Patrick Bird. I don't know Tina Miller, but I know a Pat Bird from the Pixies, if that's the same one.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and Tina's coming all the way from California.
Oh, cool.
Mary Esther, say what's up.
Yeah.
Shout these guys coming from Oregon.
All the way
wow,
from Oregon.
Yeah, so we got a lot of coming
all
up.
over Turtle Island. Cool.
Really, really cool. So, Rod, why don't you let the audience know a little bit of who you are, where you come from, introduce yourself to the crowd here in Powhatans.
Okay. My name's Rod Belanger. I'm from. I'll talk a little bit about where I'm from. My Indian name is Makakanis Kayoyo, which means coyote howling in our language. I'm from Broadview area, Broadview, Saskatchewan, located east of Regina, about an hour and a half. I come from a First Nation there by the name of Ochapways First Nation. Beat into the just up on what's going on in our area with our First Nation. First of all, Ochapways was not a signatory to treaty in Treaty 4. In 136, 135 years ago, the Indian agent had created an amalgamation of two bands, Kakishiwil and Chekachas, and I'm a descendant from the Chekachas people, and we just recently, over many years of being in the courts, finally got recognition as a band, a band under treaty. If you were to ever go down to Treaty 4 Governance Building and look at some of the displays of what went on in the area in regards to treaty, you would see Chekachaz's signature or his X amongst the treaty signers in Treaty 4. So that just happened just recently, and so it kind of caused a little split in our well, not really a split, but quite a bit of chaos within our community. But the recognition by the federal government of their wrongdoing and unlawfully amalgamating our two bands, we finally got recognition that we are Chekachas, we are a signatory to treaty, and we are Ahio people from Treaty 4 territory. So yeah, that kind of just happened just recently. So we've been I sit on the lands, laws, and natural resources with Ochapwace, and this is what we've been dealing with this court case over the past month or so. So yeah, that's been quite a bit of work. The whole part of the work is digging up the history, and the whole thing about what the Indian Act had done to our people was, if you talk to Indian people and ask them where they're from, they usually tell them they're from the reserve, but that's all that they know. The Indian Act has actually taken away their identity and their relationship and connection to the land. And under the Indian Act, all they know is that they're from a reserve, and there's a lot more to that than just being from a reserve. So it's caused our people to actually go back in history and figure out who we are as a treaty people, as a people that signed treaty with the crown. But yeah, that's just a little bit of what's happening in the area that I come from. Yeah.
Yeah, man. So you unloaded a lot of things there for
That's just a little intro.
yeah, and that's kind of for people, to start asking those questions, they're more than just from a reserve, right?
Yes.
And maybe you could let's dive into that. Let's talk about a little bit about treaties. That's kind of why I wanted to have you on. You're a man who studied a lot about it. You know a lot about the histories, specifically a lot from your area, right? So, what are some things that maybe young Indigenous people like me, young kind of growing up, that they should know about?
Okay. First of all, I'm probably just like you. Um, I'm probably just like everybody else. This is something they don't teach you in school. It's something to me, it's birthed in ceremony, and a lot of our people have been disconnected from their identity as Indigenous people and belonging to the land, their connections to the land.
Mm-hmm.
And I found through my journey and in this time that I'm living, that in order to escape the clutch of colonialism and the clutch of assimilation, our people must return back to ceremony. And I'm not talking about a pan-indigenized sort of ceremony, but I'm talking about ceremonies that are connected with the clans or the people that we belong to.
Mm-hmm.
My personal experience was being disconnected for a long time, and like I mentioned before, the only identity that I had as Indian person was belonging to a reserve and having a number under the Indian Act system. Other than that, I had some formal knowledge of who my family was and who my grandparents were in my chapan and so on and so forth. But it goes deeper than that. And when I began to heal, I want to use that word heal because we've suffered a lot of trauma and a lot of impacts from colonialism that have left Indigenous people broken and undone and disconnected. And so, personally, with myself, I jumped back on that what they call the red road, and what people have called or designated the red road. And I personally took an inventory of myself and made a pact with Creator that I would go back and search out my identity and reconnect to who I was as an Indigenous person.
Mm-hmm.
So it had there's quite a bit of interest that I had, but the biggest one was the treaties, and how that has impacted my life and my connection to treaty. And we have. I'm from Treaty 4, by the way. Canada had fast tracked the treaty process and created treaties 1 to 11 back when Canada was forming, and in their process, they created the numbered treaties 1 to 11, and I belong to Treaty 4. It stretches across parts of the west side, east side of Manitoba, up around Wewaysecapo, all the way to Nikanit, Maple Creek area in Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, if you Google treaties, you'll see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Treaty 4 and the extensive treaty numbered treaties in the province of Saskatchewan. And sometimes we wonder when we look at the maps how those treaties are crossing provincial boundaries, borders, but that wasn't always so. In I think it was 1905 or so. Saskatchewan had created boundaries that crossed over our treaty territories. Therefore, part of Treaty 4 is in Manitoba.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these things interested me earlier on in my quest to reconnect to who I was as an Indigenous person. But it went farther than that. It went through the process of ceremony. But the thing that I wanted to know the most was the ceremony part in how this played out, because we can go to the bookstores and we could purchase some of the earlier versions of treaties, and we can read those, and we can get pretty confused about what's written in those books, just because this is Canada's narration or interpretation of what went on during these times of treaty signing. Now with I had talked to some people about the process in how this actually took place, and there was a lot of chaos going on during the time of Treaty 4. It was kind of like almost like a no-win situation for Indigenous people at that time signing treaty, just because of the interpretation of what Canada was stating to us in treaty, in the negotiation side, and in what we were taking in as information and trying to decipher it through language. During that time, they had an interpreter by the name of Charles Pratt. But even in that sense, when you read the books that Canada has written on treaties, they kind of candy coat and gloss this person into what he interpreted from the negotiations was actually true and intent as far as treaty went. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't from our perspective as far as what Canada was trying to do with these treaties. One thing, I was talking to one of our knowledge keepers here in Treaty 4 area, and I wanted to understand how this process worked from our view, from our side, from our Nehio side. And the whole thing about the whole treaty making process was that we use this term, and it's in our language, and it's asoto matawin, and it that's an interpretation. It was a sacred oath. We were making a sacred. This was part of making a sacred oath, and this was something that white people could not understand in our language how we interpreted what we were doing. This was very sacred to Indigenous people, and the process of this being sacred was raising the pipe. And a lot of times, like I've been to the Treaty 1 to 11 meetings in the West, and a few places where they've had them, and they've had some of the treaty, some of the pipes from these treaties. And I've always wanted to understand what the pipe had in connection with the treaties. And this is what it was, this sacred oath making. What this sacred oath making was similar to in white man religious terms, a covenant. And this covenant process was a process where man made this covenant with God that can never be broken. And this is almost similar in contrast to the oath that we were doing through pipe ceremony. We had four chiefs at Treaty 4. I don't all to, but one of the chiefs was from our area. His name was Kakisuit, and he was one of the main pipe carriers at Treaty 4. And during this time of negotiations, white people were trying to speed up this process of negotiation of treaty, but we had to smoke pipe. We had to get directions. Prior to contact, we had our governance systems set in place. We had our natural laws set in place. We've had our economics set in place. We knew our jurisdictions. We understood the other nations of people that lived around us. It wasn't uncommon for our people back in this time to speak several languages. My great grandfather was an interpreter, and it must have been I would have liked to meet this man. We have pictures of him, but he was able to speak Nakota, Lakota, Dakota, Assiniboine, Nakwe, which is Soto, and of course Nehio. He was fluent in those languages.
That's awesome.
So it was quite common. But back to this process of pipe. These treaties were Treaty 4 was Treaty 4 took a little bit longer than Treaty 1, 2, and 3. Just because some of the chiefs that were at one of the chiefs at Treaty 4 was questioned the commissioner in regards to the sale of Rupert's land.
Yeah.
And Rupert's land was not for sale, but Canada at the time wasn't established yet, and Hudson Bay was the one who was creating sort of government policies in regards to the land. And there had been a whole bunch of interest in Rupert's land because of the fertility of the land, and their future agenda for their future agenda under their economic agenda. They wanted to farm this land. So what they did was they sold this land without knowledge of without Chief Mime. He was Chief Cody. This selling of Rupert's land affected the Ojibwe people. It was like if I came to your place and picked up your van and went and sold it to somebody, and you had no knowledge of this. This was questioned under this treaty negotiation, but it was already too late. Canada had already imposed himself on Indigenous territory and sold this land to Canada. So this was a big problem at Treaty 4, but this isn't so much discussed in a lot of the books you read, well, some of the earlier treaty books, but we know about this.
Mhm.
And this has even been brought up at some of the treaty talks that I've been to, the sale of Rupert's land because it was illegal.
Hmm.
So like there's a lot. This topic of treaty is so huge. It doesn't include the other arrangements that Canada had made with Indigenous people in the East, the Huron treaties, the Robertson's treaties, um, and other agreements that Canada had created. But people don't understand that these treaties were actually a whole process of uh, Canada being in position to establish themselves, and you hear this term lots today out there, that Canada is um, living on stolen lands.
Mhm.
And in reality, in reality, they are. I'm going to read something here in some of my searchings here, but some of the history. If we're going to understand treaties, we got to understand what went on prior to contact,
Yeah.
and we got to understand where this idea that the British Crown could have access to Canada and can claim.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too.
Yeah, there was this huge thing called the Magna Carta. I think we've taken this in some of our social studies in grade school, even though we didn't know what this actually meant.
Yeah,
What is it called?
the Magna Carta.
Yeah, the Magna Carta. It was a foundation to British common law, and it embodied the principles, and it was a monarch and government. It was a form of government, and it states that it could not just take land from the people, but according to this principle, there are only two ways that the British Crown could have acquired lands from other people, and that was through treaty and or conquering the people. And Indigenous people never went to battle with the British Crown, so they created treaties. The treaties in the West were significant because of what was going on in the USA at the time. Um, I heard Trump, after he got elected, stating that he would one of his tasks, one of his bucket listings, was to go and get that land back in Canada that the United States should have gotten a long time ago.
Really?
And what he's talking about is Western Canada. Um, during the wars in the South, and the things that were going on with our people south of the Medicine Line, as far as politics and land loss goes, the United States was eyeing up Canada and eyeing up the West, and
Yeah.
In order for Canada to uh, not go to war with the States, they made treaties with the Indians in the West. And one thing about these treaties that they made, they were recognized internationally. It seemed like at this time, at this certain time and juncture in the when they were creating these treaties, these weren't the only places that they were creating treaties, but it seemed like back in those days it became a fad to make a treaty. But these treaties that they made, they were recognized under international law, and even yet today at the United Nations, the treaties that we made with the British Crown, they're still recognized under international law.
Hmm.
So in our territory here, like going back to the point that we didn't make treaty um, uh, in a sense where we were just signing a document, but it was a spiritual thing to us because of our connection to the land. Our people, when we talk about Pima Tisuin, which is life, our whole life systems that caused us to live the way that we lived prior to contact. We were connected to everything. We were connected to the land. We were connected to the water. We were connected to the animals. We were connected to the plants. We were connected to everything around us, and this was part of our this is part of our culture, a part of our makeup. So when we put these pipes together and when we raised them at this time of treaty signing, it was something that the British didn't recognize as spiritual as uh, it was to us. That
Mhm.
these treaties were sacred, and it had to do with the land. And the whole thing about our ceremonies, even yet today, you go into some of our ceremonies, and some of these discussions around treaty are talked about, and it's not so much the words that are spoken, but it's the sense of our ancestors still with us in these ceremonies, and us understanding that we still have an obligation to the land. We still have an obligation to Pima Tisuin, everything that lives, everything that we're connected to,
Mhm.
despite Canada's not obligating to these uh, treaties at all. In fact, an understanding that we have of after the treaties were made, that they were broken right away. And we got to understand too the process and what was going on with the Canadian government in the East in their already development, ready to roll out the Indian Act. A lot of people don't. A lot of people don't understand the difference between the treaties, and the Indian Act. The Indian Act was imposed upon us to suppress us, and it has nothing to do with treaty. But
Yeah.
it created mayhem when it came down to the treaties. Like we can talk all night about um, even what's happening with our treaties today.
Mhm.
But like for our young people out there, and for those that are disconnected from the land, disconnected from language, disconnected from practicing culture and tradition, the process of assimilation and colonialism that affects our very being. I'm not talking about like all of a sudden uh, waking up in the morning and say I got to go live back in a teepee. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm I'm not talking about that at all. I'm trying to help people understand that they need to take this journey of finding out who they are as Indigenous people, and who they're connected to. I I work in the public school system here in the city, and I work at a particular school that houses all Indigenous kids, and I talk to these kids, and you can tell through some of the discussions that I have with them that they're lost. They have absolutely zero idea of who they are. So
Mm.
there's a process that we have to take to educate our young people. Whether it's you can't drag somebody into sweat, or you can't drag anybody into ceremony, but you can help them. You can help them find their way back. I I share with a lot of the young people that if you looked in your history, you can look back to find out who your grandparents were, who your great grandparents were, and who your great great grandparents were, and you can ask questions, and there's still history there. You can still
Mhm.
find out. You can still find out what sorts of roles that your great great grandparents played within their clans or within their communities. We have a strong sense that even though our ancestors are not with us in the natural sense, we still strongly believe that they're still with us in a spiritual sense, and that they're still leading, and that they're still guiding.
Mhm.
I had an experience not too long ago. Um, me telling this to people in my own experience, um, having to think that that this is never going to happen. Um, I went through this process of going back to figure out and find out who my great great grandfather was and what sorts of roles that he played uh, within Chickachaz's people, and finding out that he was a pipe carrier and a big lodge man um, uh, was very comforting to know. We have pictures of him, and he lived to be 105 or 6 years old.
Wow.
Mm.
And one of my older cousins was had the opportunity to actually, when he was young, he was a small boy, actually see this man. He was about 6'6", 6'7". He was a very tall man, but before he passed away, he was losing his sight,
Yeah.
and the thing that he remembered was this old man getting up in the morning and going outside. They uh, our people lived in mud shacks long time ago. After uh, they still had their teepees and stuff, but lots of them built mud shacks. And the old people, they built a mud shack, and they lived in that. But he would sit out there early in the morning, and he would sing these songs. And when my cousin told me this, it made me wonder what kind of songs that he sung.
Mhm.
I'm sure it wasn't round dance songs, and I'm sure it wasn't the powwow songs that we hear today. What
Yeah.
he was a man entrusted, and it made me think of the responsibilities that he had as a big lodge man and a pipe carrier, a bundle carrier, and the songs that he sang. Uh, he was singing. I still don't know what they were, but I had taken this to I had taken this to ceremony because I was really sad. I was
Yeah.
thinking I was thinking because of what Canada had done to us after treaty, um, in creating all these policies where we couldn't have ceremony, and we couldn't dance, and we couldn't uh, live practice the spiritual things that kept us in existence for thousands of years. It made me sad that these things couldn't have been passed down to the lineage to our generation, and we could have still been singing these songs. Because when I think about those songs, I think about those uh, where did these songs come from? I mean, they must have been passed on way prior to contact. Sometimes I get dreamy about it and think that these are songs that have been passed down for thousands of years because of uh, the way that we handed down all of our traditions through
Yeah.
oral teaching and our practices. But in ceremony, I was told that, and I strongly believe that these people are still here, and that these songs are still these songs are still being sung. And it was about a month or so ago. I was in ceremony, and I had mentioned uh, I put on a sweat for my daughter because she's over in Iraq right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was kind of like worried about her and stuff. So I took this to, I went and had, I put on a sweat for her, and there was a man in the sweat. He was asking me about my who my people were, like my family and stuff. And it just so happened that he remembered the old man. He used to go from our area. They used to go to Quakatus, and they still practice a lot of ceremony and stuff in Quakatus, and they remember the old man. And uh, he had actually, that old man had actually passed down a song to them.
No
And,
way.
yeah, and it just kind of freaked me out because they sang that song in ceremony, and it really got to me, because a long time ago I was thinking this could never happen, but those songs are still out there.
Yeah.
And our the process of reconnecting to who we are as Indigenous people at any age is very real.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so all these things that went on around uh, treaty time are important for us to know. We could talk about what went on after the treaties, but this thing about the people, it wasn't that long ago when you think about it.
It wasn't. No.
It uh, Treaty 4 was 1874. It wasn't that long ago. There's still quite a bit of vibrancy of our language. Um, we always talked in the South here that the North has the language, and we're stuck with speaking English.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to notice a lot in our area, quite a bit of resurgence of our language. And when we go to ceremony and stuff like that, it's always spoken, and I always wish that it could just stay like that, because
Yeah.
it really helps us connect to who we are as Indigenous people.
Mhm.
So, anyways, um, this is what kind of pushed me on into my journey into looking into the treaties.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's something way more than just academia kind of process of wanting to know what happened during treaties. But as Indigenous people, if we can understand where we come from and understand the connection to who we are as Nehio, or Nakota, or Lakota, or Assiniboine, or however this affected these people, this knowledge uh, of treaty from our perspective, and the understanding of treaty from our perspective, the understanding that those pipes weren't just novelties lifted at the time of treaty, and understanding all the connection of ceremony, and understanding all the connection of language and tradition to those times, will help us better. Uh, uh, we need to have. I feel like there's like a quiet resurgence of the understanding of what happened to us as Indigenous people. We're starting to wake up, and it seems like sometimes I'm stuck in the 1800s, but I'm stuck there for a reason, because we have to understand that the ancestors are still there, the
Mm-hmm.
language is still there, the connection to the land is still there, and our ceremonies are still there.
Yeah.
And,
Mhm.
So
but
yeah.
yeah, that's kind of we can go all night talking about um, treaties 1 to 11, but I just kind of wanted to oh yeah, by the way, thank you for having me. I just wanted to like
Yeah.
I was thinking about how the discussion should go about treaties, and I talk about a lot of other things in the classroom every day,
Mm-hmm.
And I was told always I was told earlier on to not rehearse so much on paper about what I was going to say about certain topics, but just to speak from my heart.
Hmm.
Um, I felt like this is direction. This is the direction that it kind of went tonight, as far as this treaty discussion.
No, it's cool. We're learning a lot. Basically, for the most part, we just let you speak because it was so valuable. Anybody who is watching this right now, or maybe in the replay, hit that heart button, that like button, that share button as well. We're here with Rod Belanger. From Ochapowace First Nations here, talking about treaties, talking about reclaiming your identity by learning your histories and learning your past, where you come from. And he was talking about some old songs that were saying that he got to reconnect with during ceremony, which is really really cool. Um, what is like what does it mean now? I feel like a lot of racism coming on social media that we see is coming from ignorance of not knowing about the treaties, and there's a lot of misconceptions about First Nations people, about how we don't pay taxes and we get everything handed to us. Thought maybe might be good to speak on some of that, and then we can kind of go back and forth from like some history into to some of the misconceptions that we have now today in 2020. And maybe you could touch on that and tell like some of the truths about what we're fighting for, and why we're fighting for some of the rights that are not being honored. What are those things anyway? So let's some of the viewers know about that, if you could.
Yeah, racism is real, and um, I personally, I wake up every day as an Indigenous person and know that just because of who I am as an Indigenous person, I'm an automatic target.
Hmm.
And uh, this this hatred for Indigenous people goes back to the what Canada calls the founding fathers of Confederation.
Uh-huh.
All the policies. I mean, the Indian Act imposed upon Indigenous people replacing treaty was a form of racism in itself. Um, the this hate for Indians grew out of it's like colonialism is a land grab, and the thing about uh, the British coming to Canada for myself, and the fact that their uh, colonialism is built upon the idea of land ownership. We have to understand um, what was going on the other side of the ocean prior to them coming here, and the Popple Bulls, which we need to understand the doctrine of discovery, and the ways that Christendom, which was a process in where um, Christianity had focused on on the possession of land throughout the whole world, and them coming here, they didn't look at us as human beings. uh they were they looked at us as pagans and heathens because we weren't Christians
Yeah.
back in the time of Spain, and uh, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, them giving Columbus the staff to uh, go out and to take possession of land throughout the whole world, uh, despite of despite people living there or not, even though they didn't know people lived there. But just the very contact with indigenous people in this part of the world, and their idea, their Eurocentric thought that we were not Christian, and that we were either pagan or heathen.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we didn't qualify as humans.
Yeah.
So all that hate for indigenous people just isn't something that we see on social media, but
Yeah.
it's been birthed uh, in Christianity,
Yeah.
in Christendom, in their thought that they had direct contact from God, and God told them to go and conquer lands and the inhabitants that were there, and to, if just uh, subdue, um, control, rule. And this was the process of contact with indigenous people, even despite treaties, because these treaties I mentioned are literally recognized under international law, but yet not followed. But it all has to do with that process of land ownership. And indigenous people have been here for eons. And we had our systems, like I stated. We had our governance, we had our laws, we had our spiritual practices, our ceremonies, and so forth. We had all that prior to contact. But to me, racism came from uh, across the big pond.
Yeah.
And it's through their laws. Like, um, in the States, they created acts in Washington, the Dawes Act, which had uh, uh, took away the recognition of Indian land ownership, and they took it upon themselves to conquer and subdue the Indian, take away their land, relocate them, and sell Indian land. And it's the same way in Canada. Some of the biggest threat to colonialism here in Canada was the fact that Indians were still here.
Yeah.
And it was stated uh, John A. Macdonald that we were the Indian problem. And they had created policies. Like, one policy I still can't understand after treaties were made was 1885, and what happened up in Poundmaker, when Canada had stated that Poundmaker had committed treason. And because of his treasonous act, they had created a act that had locked Indians within their own reserves, uh, uh, instituting the pass system.
Mm-hmm.
And Indians not being able to uh, leave the boundaries of their homelands without permission from the Indian agent.
Yeah.
I mean, how cruel is that? Uh, to me, those were laws that were created out of pure racism.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at even the residential school era, their their idea of the reserve systems, when they, like the chief and council systems that we know today, those are not instituted by our processes or the way that we had our governance prior to contact. The Indian Act had created the chief and council system to have control of the people. And one of the big things they did in uh, part of my family was, just recently I had written scraped up documents from a from a lawyer that had donated all of his works to the FSIN um, archive, to the University of Saskatchewan archive, to the FNUC archive. He was hired to do research on uh, what took place under the Indian Act, and how the reserve systems were set up under these new chief and councils. And I see all over these documentations of how uh, my grandfather, they had him being a pipe carrier and him being a lodge man. They thought that wasn't good enough, so they wanted to create him into one of the headmen, and they gave him the position to be a counselor for agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
trying to turn spiritual people into farmers. Um,
Yeah.
and uh, reading these documents and knowing the history of who he wasn't in his rightful place, but being used as a a tool by the federal government under the Indian Act to follow through with the assimilation process of Indigenous people, which was, you talk about racist acts, and you talk about racist policies. These were some of the first ones that created quite a bit of mayhem in our territories, because we did become successful farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we did pull off crops off the land, and what was happening was just like the settlers that were um, uh, filling the west. They had brought a crop in to these places to ship on like these elevators uh, to ship east, to ship to other parts of the world. Well, our crops, because of the complaints by white farmers, that uh, they weren't able to sell their crops because of the Indian crops, they had decided that they would um, sell all the white crops first, and then do the Indians last. And lots of times, our crops wouldn't make it to market, and they would lay on the ground and they would rot.
Mm-hmm.
They were trying to turn us into farmers, but then at the same time, if we weren't able to sell our product and we weren't able to create revenue and grow, that's what they were scared of. We weren't able to grow and be competitive uh, in this new agriculture agenda that Canada had for the West and for Indians. Um, um, Another racist kind of policy that handcuffed our people economically. The Canadian Wheat Board was established, and
Mm-hmm.
it tailored, and it it served white farmers. And so, like, Indian farmers never really got off the ground after that. There's all along through history they've had Indian programs, and of course you have the odd farmer here and there that has made it. But as far as being in a competitive market with other farmers, or even being recognized, we were locked out of that, which of course was created because of racism and racist policies that Canada had created. Now, with some of the things going on, it's hard to kind of even go around the city here, with the things that are going on in BC with the pipelines. That's another thing too. Canada doesn't understand that uh, this land that they're trying to cross with this pipeline is unceded territory, meaning that it was never ceded to Canada. Those people, Wet'suwet'en people, have 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 always stated that they've been on the lands prior to contact. They have no treaty. They've never ceded their territory. Yet Canada, with with their thought that they have jurisdiction over all the lands, still through government policy, still through military action, have are still trying to take control of the land, which has caused quite a bit of racism right across Canada. I've been in some talk. I've been in some rooms where the discussion has started out real nice, and it's ended very racist, where
Uh-huh.
where Indians are living off of taxpayer dollars, where we don't own the land, where we're just drunks, get a job, get an education. And some of the things they don't understand is that when Canada made these agreements with Indigenous people, there was money put in a trust.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing the federal government will never talk about. And even though it's documented and it's in their archives and it's in their files and it's in their history, that there was a trust that was made between Canada and Indigenous people, with money going into a trust, and that um, for 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 the future we would have access to the trust. But we've never access to that trust. Think about uh, the railroad, much money they had borrowed out of the trust build the railroad that went across Canada. That money was borrowed from that trust. We don't even know if it was ever
Repaid.
repaid. But when you think about the revenue uh, agreement that Canada had made with Indigenous people, if that's true today, um, there should be revenues going into that trust every day. There should be a uh, there uh, from the oil industry, from the gas industry, from the agricultural industries in the West. All this money should be going into this trust and building interest every day when
Yeah.
you think about it.
Right.
But another thing too that creates quite a bit of talk is in 1930 they had created the NRTA, which is the Natural Resources Transfers Act.
Mm-hmm.
And where were Indigenous people at this time when they created this act? This act had it was for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and it was the Natural Resources Transfers Act that was established to have access to natural resources, mining, um, oil and gas, and forestry, and all this revenue that was created off of this act had literally built the infrastructure in the West, created what we know as the West, all these cities, all these highways, these power grids, the railroad. All this stuff was created from this Natural Transfers Resources Act of 1930, but Indigenous people were locked out of that.
Hmm.
And for some reason, that's another question that we still have is let's reopen this NRTA of 1930, but that's another thing that Canada refuses to open, uh, unlock, because it has potential for us to gravitate towards self governance.
Mm-hmm.
There's revenues there to help us establish or reestablish who we are as Indigenous people. I sometimes sit there and try and imagine how that would look if we had all the money at our hands to restore our languages,
Yeah.
to restore our land bases, to build economic viability that wouldn't threaten the lands or wouldn't threaten our treaties, but to make us equal, as in partnership with other Canadians, because these treaties were friendship treaties.
Yeah.
The these treaties were peace treaties. We agreed to share the land, and when you think about it, um, it's noted that 99.08% of the land base has been in Canada has been claimed by Canada by by the by the Canadian Crown, and
Yeah.
0.2% of the remaining land base is still under treaty, and those are treaty lands for treaty people. See, when we sign those treaties and stuff like that, uh, Sylvia McAdam talks about this, and I had some discussion with her quite some time ago. But in treaty, it talks about the 1 square mile, and that 1 square mile in Treaty 4 territory. If you look at the bands and if you look at the reserves, they've never grown since they've been established.
Mm-hmm.
They they were only established because under the 1 square mile, under the Indian Act, they had created boundaries according to the families that were going to farm within those reserves. But then what about the other people that weren't going to farm? Under treaty, they still had access to that 1 square mile. So when you think about the populations of our Indigenous people now today, and we had access to that 1 square mile, it would threaten Canada's economy and threaten Canada's growth structure and infrastructure and framework of politics if this ever happened to come alive, because our treaties our treaty is portable. It doesn't mean that I have to live. It didn't mean that I had to live in the box. I could have easily taken my 1 square mile and went and lived somewhere else in Treaty 4 territory. And if they would have obligated to the treaties and revenue shared like they should have, Indigenous people wouldn't be where they are today. They would have been able to establish themselves.
Yeah.
Uh, they wouldn't have created the structures like the residential school era, where they apprehended children to literally implode and to literally uh, um, impact and destroy Indigenous family unit. Uh, because within our structures we were safe, but the trauma and all the all the chaos that it created us, we were more distracted with being apprehended and being put in these residential schools than uh, fighting the government. There's a whole bunch of things that the government did during this time. 19, I think it was 1926. They didn't allow Indians to retain lawyers,
Yeah.
for this simple fact that Indians knew that they were getting the raw deal, and that Canada didn't want to start dealing with land claims already back then. 1951 was between those years. 1951, we were finally able to retain a lawyer, and I know you think about all this chaos, and you think about all the misunderstandings that Canadians have about Indigenous people. I always tell them to look at the dark history and the relationship that Canada, the very dark relationship that Canada has had with Indigenous people. But even in that sense, they still feel like they own the land. But
Mm-hmm.
I talk with a lot of white people as well, and a lot of white people have an understanding that yeah, they're wrong, but to get their neighbors and to get their people on board with this is almost impossible. So
Yeah.
waking up as an Indigenous man every day with the knowledge that we have, where we come from, what's happening, the healing that we're experiencing today. Um, in some of the, you know, it's not an easy road. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm probably not going to be here. Uh, I'm probably not going to be here when we start to see a little bit of progress in these areas where we get land back,
Mm-hmm.
where Canada's honoring treaties, where we're starting to move forward, where we're starting to heal, where we're starting to see a huge resurgence of our people here in Turtle Island. I I probably won't be here for that time, but um, it's 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 kind of it's kind of sad to know that I have knowledge right now that um, the last few generations of my family, your family, all the people that we know, their families have suffered this intergenerational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And trauma is something that's almost threaded through our DNA now. So when
Mm-hmm.
you think about the process of how long it has taken for us to get to where we are today and where we need to go to heal, it's going to be a long time before we see um, like real progress. Maybe treaties will look different 100 years from now, but I know for sure that there's a you can sense it. There's a resurgence of who we are as Indigenous people, and we're living in a time where we're experiencing an awakening,
Yeah.
and this is kind of what gives me hope. But I mean, some of the things that, like you mentioned, they're like having to experience racism. You know, uh, that's kind of a very difficult topic to discuss without getting angry.
Yeah, for sure.
It's it. I mean, we all know Dougie Rain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he shared on Facebook last week that he got surrounded by white boys at the mall, and I for him to have to experience threats and being called racist things, and even being called on what kind of predicament that puts people that we know in,
Mm-hmm.
um, because of Canada not wanting to understand their dark history and their relationship with Indigenous people. But I'm glad that he's safe. You know, he we know him. You know, he's able to laugh things off. But you know, a black woman came to his rescue. You
Mm-hmm.
know, started to kind of freak out on these white boys. So that's just one experience. I don't know. I kind of I'm always on the watch to see if people are in duress anywhere or being confronted by white people anywhere here in the city.
Mm-hmm.
We got to kind of we're kind of in a time where we got to watch each other's backs right now, even though we don't know everybody, but we still gotta kind of look out for each other. So you know, this racism, this level of racism is just kind of off the hook here in Canada right now. It's kind of a little bit lowered, I think, a little bit this week, but when you start to confront uh, Canada and you start to push back, this is what we get. So
Yeah. And I seen that you posted on your Facebook there how kind of Alberta put a new law out there for protesters. Basically, they get
yeah,
fined pretty pretty hefty and
fine and possible imprisonment. So
imprisonment.
yeah, and
And you talked about how a little bit about the RCMP and officers. They were created. Was their creation was more to um, what was it for, to protect our laws and stuff like that, but it just came out differently where it was just for Canada to push their agendas.
yeah, yeah, and that was another thing too. They make it look like I have you ever been to the RCMP museum here?
I haven't, no.
Okay, I don't think I'd last very long in there just because of all the lies, but there's quite a bit of their narration of their history and their providence, their prominence of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But they were sent over here to protect us, as
Yeah.
as they say. But in essence, we all know and understand the history of the RCMP in the West, and even Canada, even during the residential school era, even during that era, how Canada used a military force to apprehend our children, to take them away from the families and take them to boarding schools. Um, One man was telling me a story about a community that they came to the community and they loaded up all the children from ages school age up to the teenagers, and they carted them all off in wagons and whatever they had to take them to residential school, and the RCMP were assisting this process. And so when you think about that, how tragic that is for a community to get all of its children totally apprehended by force, by military force, by the RCMP, to cart them off to boarding school. How traumatic that left that community with with the family structures that we had, and how close we were to our cookums and our mushums and our aunties and our uncles and our families.
Mm-hmm.
To actually go in and disrupt uh, a community of people that have been living off the lands for generations. So when you think of the RCMP, you don't see those sorts of stories at
With the Hall of Fame.
at the museum here. It's tragic, but that happened all across Canada, and not just in that apprehension era, but in the '60s scoop. I mean, I was '60 scooped. I was taken from my family.
Mm-hmm.
My mother could have lived down. My mother could have lived the next block over, and because of child welfare law at the time, I my mother wasn't allowed to come find me, and I wasn't allowed to go find my mother, and who enforced that at the time? The police. If if my mother was caught um, uh, with her child, she would get arrested under law uh, by an enforcement officer. So we've had terrible dark relationship with with the RCMP and police systems here in Canada for generations. It's just, I mean, it's just I'm starting to not trust police at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of scary. They're supposed to be here to protect, but they'll protect their own. I mean, missing, murdered, and Indigenous women, that file. I mean, they can all of a sudden have thousands of military, uh, police ops, and all these sorts of people to try and take down these blockades. But then when it comes down to missing and murdered Indigenous women in the same area where these blockades are going on. They haven't lifted a finger to investigate where all these women or
Hmm.
how all these women went missing, and they refuse to open that file. So yeah, that's kind of our relationship with law enforcement and RCMP in Canada here for generations. Yeah.
Interesting. Been reading stories too of how a lot of the missing and murdered kind of there's a lot of connections to kind of pipeline areas and things like that. Like the movie what is it called,
Um, Wind River.
Wind River.
Yeah.
Kind of stories, right? That's kind of there's a really good connection between all of that, right?
And these man camps, like I can understand what these ladies are feeling and sensing in their territory with these man camps. Um, all of us know Gracie her many horses.
Mhm.
She's a police officer in the States. She had written an article not so long ago in regards to the pipelines down there, and these man camps, and the just the chaos and all the craziness that that evolves from these man camps, and how Indigenous people uh, had been targeted. I mean, it's some of these man camps aren't even there anymore, but it's left areas like Wolf Point. I remember years and years ago, we'd go down to Wolf Point to go dance at Fort Kip, and you know, Indian town. Um, it was on the reservation and stuff, and the only problems they had were the bar fights and people drinking getting out of hand a bit and stuff like that. But these man camps have devastated the pipeline, and these man camps have devastated these areas. A lot of these people in Gracie's story were uh, people, they'd come to get to work on the pipelines and on these oil rigs and in these man camps. They weren't even from this part of, or that area of the states. They were from all areas of the states, and even from other countries,
Mhm.
coming to live there. And the access to the amount of money that they had from the jobs that they had, and the creation of, oh yeah, the bringing in of drugs. Getting our people hooked on what's that, uh, crack, and meth, and some of the cheapest, easiest drugs to make, but yet getting our people hooked on them, but for what? For sexual services. In some of the stories that you read, it just wasn't the women they were going after, but it was young children. It was young boys. It even got to a place in some of the stories where cookums were hooked on the drugs themselves, and they were pimping off their grandchildren and their children to support their habits. And
Gee.
it's sad, but white people look at that and say, "Oh, those Indians, they're there they go again." But I can see some of the fears that come along with these pipelines and these the construction of these man camps. They're trying to stop those constructions in BC and Wet'suwet'en territory, just because of the dangers of and the targets that our women are going to have to face once again. It's bad enough Canada won't open a file on missing and murdered and Indigenous women. Yeah, they recognize it, but there's still way more to it than our women just missing. But then these pipelines and these camps thinks it's not going to affect our people.
Yeah, and this is like a lot of the things that are, they're not talked about, right? These little things like this, and how a lot of this stuff is connected with it, which is, just pretty crazy. And um, it's good that we're giving it some light here, but there's so much, like you said, that needs to be done, right?
Mhm.
I think I think education. Like when this stuff really first started bothering me a long time ago, um, it sent me off into a tailspin, and I went way left, and I
Hmm.
went like kind of a little bit. I wasn't using too much wisdom about it, but I kind of feel a lot more centered and in addressing a lot of these issues through education. And just because it affected me personally with the apprehension era and everything that I found out, all the history I dug up on the apprehension eras and how it affected myself and my family.
Hmm.
I can't really live there anymore. I wouldn't be very productive, or I wouldn't be able to do what I do if I stayed there. So I had to do something for myself. And once again, I go back to um, stating that this is all done in ceremony, and this
Hmm.
is all done in reconnection to language and
Yeah.
reconnection to our traditions and our culture. Um, I don't think I'd be a very peaceful person if I went the other route. I think I I don't know. We tend to do things crazy when we're not centered.
Yeah.
So I think education is. I'm in a place where Creator has me, and I'm I'm able to educate. Sometimes I don't have a filter on that education, and it kind of gets me in trouble once in a while. But people need to know the truth.
Yeah.
Um,
Those dark histories.
yes, dark histories.
I have a question though, like, and I know that you post a lot about this, about reconciliation, how it's kind of like a myth, it's not happening. But in you basically, this would be a personal question to you. If reconciliation was a real thing, and if we really got there, how does that look? Because when I hear conversations like this, it's more like the kind of the white people are confused. That does that mean they just give up all the land back, and then they go away, or like they move away, or like they just confused of what that really looks like? What in your mind would it really look like in terms of like the treaties fully honored, and how would that kind of give people a kind of a visual of what that would look like if we got there, in your opinion?
Yeah, yeah. Uh, me reconciliation, um, like the TRC, the, that process of reconciliation. Once again, it's it's a term, and it's narrated. It's a narrated interpretation of what Canada thinks reconciliation is.
Hmm.
Um, I I I have some schooling in my background. I have my business admin, and when I was in accounting, we um, we did these things um, to reconcile um, uh, parts of our accounting processes. And when I think of reconciling, I think of uh, putting back um, putting back something that was taken.
Hmm.
So uh, you can't reconcile with Indigenous people on just that word alone, but there has to be way more action. When you think of all those 94 calls to reconciliation, um, how many of those do you actually think have actually taken place? I don't think any of them have, to be honest. my view of reconciliation is Canada putting down its arms,
Mm-hmm.
Canada recognizing its racist policies. It's Canada uh, through a process bringing um, Indigenous people to a table and figuring out how to recreate um, the treaties that obligate to them. It's a process of recognizing that there was a trust set in place.
Mm-hmm.
So it's there's some things that Canada is going to lose. They're so used to to ownership, and that's one thing in a colonial mindset is the ownership of land. And you see these things, you see all these postings about land back and stuff like that. That would be part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
um, um, the one thing Canada could have did that would have been on track to for Indigenous people to start to experience reconciliation in a true sense was the adoption of UNDRIP.
Yeah.
Um, ca- uh, uh, Canada was one of 3 countries that refused to sign UNDRIP. United States, New Zealand, no, United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Uh, just because of the way that Canada has established itself in um, uh, taking ownership of the land.
Can you explain a
Un-
little bit of what UNDRIP is for some our viewers? What
un-
I don't really know what that is either.
UNDRIP is the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People.
Mhm.
And I had the opportunity. We have a man from our First Nation. His name is Wes George, and Wes worked in the 90s. Our chief had uh, our chief had invested in Wes to work at a United Nations level for Indigenous people. So we didn't have a seat yet at the UN, but Wes started this work back in the, I believe, the late 80s, early 90s. And we Ochapwace is one of the first nations in Canada to adopt an UNDRIP, and to actually the United Nations used Ochapwace as an example of what Indigenous people face as a First Nation under a treaty with Canada.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, under this UNDRIP process, they had a Northern Caucus and a Southern Caucus, and I work with Wes quite close, and I still do. And he was involved with the United Nations quite extensively. He's been there many times, not just at the UN in New York, but at the UN in Geneva, and some of the in some of the other places in the world where Indigenous people are affected by colonialism. And anyways, with this UNDRIP process, I was able to be part of the Northern Caucus, and part of the final report that went to the United Nations 2 years ago in July. That report was read, the final report, and our contribution as a Northern Caucus and my contribution was in regards to the land. And if people are interested in knowing what UNDRIP really states, they can Google that, and they can get the whole document off of Google in regards to UNDRIP.
Mm-hmm.
But Canada, if Canada would have adopted UNDRIP in its rawest form, and brought it as a reconciliation tool to reconcile our relationships with Canada under treaties and other arrangements with Indigenous people. That would have worked. But as far as the Canadian Constitution, the way the Canadian Constitution is set up, where we're only defined in the Canadian Constitution under Section 35 under Aboriginal rights and title, and so this whole fixing of the Canadian Constitution to house UNDRIP would have been would have been probably the tool to fix everything, because it talks quite heavily in UNDRIP in regards to our rights to self-govern, our rights to own land, our rights to be economic viable and independent. And these are all the things that Indigenous people have faced because of colonialism throughout the world. And so, I mean, it's not just Canadian Indigenous people, but it's Indigenous people throughout the whole world this is affected. But that was one thing that probably could have corrected, in my view, could have corrected this, or reconciled this relationship between Canada and Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
By them basically signing this UNDRIP, signing on with that, does that mean like United Nations come and help enforce that our treaties are honored?
One thing, because of the history of the United States and Canada with under the Dawes Act in the States, and under the acts that Canada had created, like the Gradual Civilization Act, the Gradual Civilization Act, and what do you call that? The Gradual Enfranchise Act. These acts in themselves have displaced Indigenous people in their original forms, even in their land locations.
Mm-hmm.
It's once again, it's very traumatic for people to understand that all of a sudden people are being relocated to a point where you know, the going down to Florida, the Trail of Tears, where people literally died being relocated. You know, they weren't dying because they were starving and stuff like that. They were dying because their spirits are dying. They were being disconnected from their original homelands. And anyways, this UNDRIP thing Canada thinks and the United States thinks would never work, just because of the way that Canada and the United States is structured under the rule of law now.
Yeah.
Under on our side of treaty and on our side of recognition of rule of law, that rule of law doesn't apply to us. Mm-hmm. But when you think about when we should have done something, if we would have had the knowledge of what was going to happen in the future, this should have never have taken place because of their rule of law back in the day when our people were of great number. This just wouldn't have happened. But because Canada and the United States, like, there's 380 million people in the States, and there's 33 million people here in Canada, compared to how much Indigenous people?
Yeah.
So all we have, and what we can't let loose of is our treaties, because they're recognized under international law, and they're still living, breathing documents. That's the only thing that's keeping us alive here in Canada. But UNDRIP would have been one document under the United Nations and their recognition of how Canada has treated Indigenous people, if that would have been instituted into Canada's process as a mechanism to heal or to bring uh, uh, amends to Indigenous people, this probably would have helped us out quite a bit.
Hmm.
But yeah, that was Canada was one of the countries that refused to sign on to UNDRIP. So yeah.
This is pretty crazy, man. Just learning about all this stuff. I had a lot of value today. There's so much comments that came through as well. We never got to go through it. This is one of the most comments that we had in a podcast kind of come through. So I think a lot of people were shouting out of all the value they were getting from you, which is really cool. Um, so if you guys are liking what you guys were learning today in this podcast, hit that heart button, hit that like button. If you're on YouTube, hit that thumbs up button, share this. Um, yeah, so I wanted to actually kind of put out some of the comments that were coming in here, some questions that were coming through as well for you. So I wanted to come and kind of through that as well before we bring this in for a landing. This has been such a great time. So if I went up, let's see here. So question mark Magna Carta. We kind of went through that already, and just to make it clear too, hey, the non-Indigenous people,
Oh yeah.
when they do their taxes, they're not taking care of all the First Nations people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's I hear that a lot. Hello from Mexico. What else do we have here? Coming from the Tatacoop First Nations. Thank you for your insight. Very informative and interesting. Love it. So that's some of the shout out to you. So much history go through. The new world order is upon us. Rise up, brothers and sisters. Right on. Brian Deschamps was on here. Broski. Christians started crusades in the 11th century, fighting Muslims over spiritual
Yeah.
sites.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They went around fighting for spiritual sites.
Yeah.
Miigwech for sharing for important information. So this is from Montreal, the Algonquin brothers and sisters there. Let's see here. Has anyone read any of the treaties that were made from the government versus all tribes far back as 1700s, where they marked thumbprints with the X? That's Susan. Oh, Broski Nathan K was on. He wanted to know about the treaties and for his grandchildren and their grandchildren for the next hundred next 50 years. What's up, Cola? Let's see. That's Skoden Finden. That's an awesome.
Finden.
Yeah, so a lot of things. So, have you read the some of the books like No Surrender and Clearing the Plains, things like that?
Clearing the Plains is a must read.
Mm-hmm.
Clearing the Plains is a must read. Right now, there's another book that I'm. There's a few books that I'm chopping at right now. In fact, I'll get it here and I'll show you it. Just hang on.
Yeah, let's let our listeners hear some, like, if you guys want to continue on this journey, some of the books that you can read. One of them was No Surrender. And the other one, Clearing the Plains, and this is some books that you could Google, and talks a lot about the treaties. And so yeah, Rana's talking about maybe some books that you recommend some people to read to continue their journey.
This book is this is a must read if you want to understand pagans in the promised land and how the federal government in the United States and Canada had established themselves under the rule of law, and how their how they had made claims to the land under the auspices of the Old Testament
Mm-hmm.
in a biblical sense, where all their history and even some of the landmarks in Washington, in how they've this just 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 created this doctrine of discovery, and uh, Indian people are kind of like way far in the background, but still part of that history. But if anybody wants to know how we got to where we are today, this is a very powerful read.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a read, but it's a study tool. And Stephen Newcomb is a Indigenous professor, I think, down at Arizona State University. And uh, is he down at Arizona? Um, yeah, but if anybody's into reading or wants to, um, yeah, check out some history about how things evolved here in what they call the New World. That's a pretty interesting read.
Awesome, man. That's good. That's good.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I know what you like you said earlier today. We could go and talk for hours and hours about this stuff. So wanted to basically pick your brain here, and I was just thinking about some of the conversations we had during the Power Trail and stuff like that. I'd love to have you on again to talk about your life too as well, because you have a very interesting life where you lived overseas in Germany for a while and got to learn the language, and you performed with some rock stars, dancing, and
yeah,
that you also lived on stateside. Hey, so you
yeah.
you
I live stateside too.
you have an idea of being like an American as well as a Canadian.
Well, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I still kind of feel like there's not a border there because there never was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and of course, we have to understand the J Treaty, allowing us to have free access
Yeah.
to the states and stuff like that.
Is
That
there
yeah,
like I've been seeing posts of how the J Treaty hasn't is like they're trying to debunk it, saying
yeah,
it's no longer there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's they're still recognizing it, but they're still in a process of trying to, like, it's old now or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing too. Like I stated, these treaties are recognized under international law, so
Yeah.
it would be quite a process to literally debunk a treaty like that. So
Which is weird because I remember when we were in the States, and one of our friends there was trying to get a SIN number in America, and then they were talking about J Treaty, and then the person who was working behind the counter was saying that it was no longer um, recognized or whatever it was. You
yeah,
know.
yeah. I think when I was down there, I got mine in like 6 days.
Mhm.
Um, but of course, I wasn't that far down. I was more along the Northern High Line.
Yeah,
Uh, I think it was. I think it was. I think it was Great Falls.
yeah, that you
Yeah,
got
yeah,
yours over
yeah,
there.
yeah. But it only took like six days. But
Nice.
yeah,
So I guess to bring this into a closing, man, you talked a lot about how the young people should kind of find themselves and their identity, their language.
yeah.
Any other advice you have for maybe someone watching this who is interested in just getting into that reconciliation, getting into honoring treaties for the next generation?
Well,
Things that they could do, your ideas, your opinions, something you can leave with for everybody here today.
okay. I'll say this in Korean, then I'll touch on that.
Okay.
Nanaskin oma anots niwa no. Um, oh, my Cree just left me. Let me ask it. Oh, it just slipped. I'm just I think I'm at the end of my day here. But
Sure.
anyways,
Uh,
um, I guess what I can leave with you about that is, uh, I guess finding a starting point, and I know it's not anything anybody can do for anybody, but it's something of a journey that people have to recognize and go on their own.
mhm,
And sometimes it could be lonely, and sometimes you can feel like, what's the use, and throw up your hands and just give up. But um, if anybody has access to ceremony, um, if anybody doesn't know people that go to ceremony, one thing I knew, that in some of my darkest times, because I come from a life of addictions, um, in my darkest times, there was a spark of belief that there was good people out there,
mhm,
and that I believe that that Creator can help me cross paths with these people. And if people feel stuck, there's nothing like uh, finding somebody with sage or some sweetgrass and having a good smudge, and asking Creator to open these doors, and to ask for the people that needs to be, uh, just to help you get along. He will help you with these people, with this networking that will help us, or help you get back to uh, places that you should be in your life.
mhm.
Um, it's it's not an easy journey. Um, I think when I was on the other side of things, and I thought I was doing well as a Indigenous man, my life was full of alcohol, and I worked in the system, and I made money, and that was my whole life. And when you wake up, and you need this to survive, there's going to be some lonely times. Um, all those people that I thought were my friends, and uh, they're not around anymore. All the jobs that were so easy to get aren't easy to get anymore. Um, you tend to be labeled as maybe a troublemaker, or somebody with some problems or whatever. But all you are is on your journey, and like I mentioned, sometimes it gets hard. But
Mm,
I'm at a place in my life where I'm probably more content, and more happy with what's going on than I ever have been. So, well, what I wanted to say in Cree was Ninanaskatin Uma Anuts Kitwam Kiskau Iwapataman.
mhm,
And that means I'm thankful for yet another day.
mhm.
And that's I have a bunch of language stuff on my phone and stuff. And when I pray, I go to my phone and pull out the language. It's
Yeah.
important. So I think this was. I thank you for allowing me to come on your live podcast.
Mhm.
And, feel honored, and even though we are kind of all over the place tonight with subjects, um, and topics, and truth, and some sensitive areas and stuff, I'm still thankful that you asked me to come and be on. And
Uh, would I be able to step in real quick?
yep.
As a young First Nations man starting his journey here in life, and not really knowing who I am, and not really knowing anything about the treaties or nothing like that. I'm only 26 years old, and I don't really know where I'm from or what happened in my area.
Hmm.
This has been a really informative, emotional experience for me because I'm it's just starting to learn who I am, and for me, it's kind of scary to talk about this stuff because I don't have that strength of knowing who I am, and I just like to say thank you for that,
Yeah,
for providing that information, and it's really awesome
yeah,
to have you.
yeah.
Thank you.
I encourage you to get into some ceremony there.
Hmm.
Um, we get to a place in our life where we can't find the words, and when we start to speak and our voice gets shaky, those are times when we start to find our voice. And
Hmm.
I had so many crazy experiences when I began to start to talk about this stuff. That was one thing that I learned when my voice got shaky. It was this creator helping me to find my voice. We need to find our voice in this time, and network and connect to people that really need to be in our worlds, because lots of bad things have happened to us. You know, you shouldn't be disconnected from your family
Hmm.
or from knowledge of the history of who you are and where you come from. But that was all part of assimilation and the colonial experience. So once again, Pat, I thank you very much, and I think the world of you guys. We're bros in the powwow world, and it's um, it's so awesome to stand on the sidelines or even dance with you guys. You know, I I was feeling myself out at Lethbridge, but I still got out there and danced with you guys,
which was so
and and had a decent time. But
yeah,
man, I always like watching Jared dance. He's a good dancer, and it looks like you guys are. It looks like you're kind of grooming him and training him
yeah, he's
for
learning.
the big times. But that's so awesome, and probably won't see you guys to Regina, but it'll be a good time down here. So
Sweet man. My mom told me this word, and I want to end it off with this because it kind of felt like the theme. But she taught me this Cree word. It goes "abachita nehio mamtenichigan," and which means the nehio indigenous way of thinking.
mhm,
You
mhm.
know,
Yeah,
just and I think that's kind of what I felt. You
yeah,
know, going through this is to think indigenous through this time. You know,
yeah,
think who you are, where you come from, your language. So
Hmm.
abachita nehio mamtenichigan, and to share that with the viewers here today. So, all right, Rod, you have a good night.
yeah,
Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
We had
yeah.
people all
Uh-huh.
over the world basically in here today, liking and sharing everything. So, thank you guys, our Power Times family, for being here today. And thanks, Rod. You have a good night, and
Okay.
see you guys later.
See you, John. Bye.
Bye.
Ahoo.